Hello everyone, and welcome to my YouTube channel. This will be my first coding tutorial, so I'd appreciate the feedback in the comments below. In this video series, I'll be going over how I work with NestJS and the various tools I use to build backend APIs. For context, I work as a senior software engineer, primarily on the backend with TypeScript, and I've been using Nest for a while now. It's definitely my preferred way of building backends in Node. If you're coming from a more traditional Node situation, you're likely using Express with some custom setup, but NestJS does a lot of the heavy lifting for you that you typically would do when you're setting up a Node.js API. So this is the website. They have a cat, which I like. And if you take a look, it talks about being highly modular, type safe, and coming with dependency injection, all of which are great things. And for me personally, I just like the fact that everything just works and it makes sense in terms of a backend framework. So the docs are really good. You can go through them during your own time. I highly recommend it. If you just follow the docs, you should be able to get through most of it. However, in this video series, I'm going over specifically what I do to basically set up a Node.js application with Nest, and specifically using monorepos as well. So in terms of monorepos, I'm going to be using this tool called NX. So NX is a way for you to manage monorepos. If you've been exposed to microservices, what you likely have is a setup where you have all these different repos in GitHub or GitLab, where you have, maybe you might have an auth API or a payments API, and maybe a payments UI and all these different front ends and back ends. But if you were to put all of that in one place, it would be easier to modify the code and see what's going on. For me, for example, I like to do search and replace quite a bit, and having all the code in one project is really awesome, and it just reduces the amount of complexity of having multiple repos. So that's what you hope to gain from using NX, and specifically a generator from NX called NX Nest. Essentially, what we're going to be doing is we'll be building this NestJS application using NX as the monorepo. So we'll create a workspace, and then we will create an API within that workspace, and then we can build on top of that. So that's going to be the flow of what we do today. All right, so let's get started. So I'm in a folder in my terminal called tutorials. You can create this wherever you want. I'm going to start over here in the NX Nest documentation. So if I click the command, you can see this is how you generate a new workspace. So I'm just going to put that in here. But one thing I'm going to do is add a P at the beginning of this. So I'm using something called PNPM. I've installed this already on my machine. For those who don't know, PNPM is a disk space efficient package manager. With NPM specifically, you typically install stuff in your Node modules within your project. So you can imagine if you had React 18 installed on your machine in multiple projects, you would have multiple versions of the same React. Whereas with PNPM, you can basically have one version of React 18 stored in a central location and reused by your various projects on the same computer. So you can basically save a lot of disk space. So it's pretty cool for that. So that's why I'm using PNPX here specifically. If you just have NPM, you can just use NPX, which is fine. So in this case, I'm going to call my workspace Nest Workspace. Okay, and I'm going to call my application General API. So this application would be the API that I'm creating within the workspace. So I'm going to go through, it's going to ask me a bunch of questions. I don't want to generate a Docker file for now. I'm going to say do it later for CI, and also I don't want to start with remote caching. So it's generating the actual project for me. It's going to take a little bit, but once that's done, I'll be able to open this in my code editor. All right, awesome. So we've got the Nest workspace generated. So I'm going to open the project in my code editor. I'm using Golang. You can use whatever you want, of course. I personally like using JetBrains IDEs. They just make sense to me. I also use NeoVim, but I'm going to be using a proper IDE in this case. Well, NeoVim is also a proper IDE. Anyway, this is the project that's been created. So as you can see, we have VS Code. We have a lot of files that have been created. In this case, we have a VS Code directory for extensions. If you're using VS Code, you get some extensions out of the box, or the ones that should be installed when you use this project. You can see we have prettier configurations, we've got ESLint configurations, and we've got a bunch of stuff in the package.json. We've got dev dependencies. So all of this is done by NX. So it's created a workspace for us. And because we said we want a Nest workspace, it's gone ahead and created some things for us specifically in the apps directory. So you can see we have two directories in here. We have general API and general API end-to-end. So this is specifically for tests Personally, I like to just straight up delete this because I like to have my own configuration for tests, but we'll go over that in the next video. And in general API, I'm just going to give you a quick overview of how NestJS works behind the scenes. So you could see here, of course, we're using TypeScript. You can see we have some TypeScript configs already configured for us, which is great. And you can see we have this project.json, which is for NX specifically. So you can imagine this is a package.json file essentially. So if I go into the main.ts file for the general API, you can see we have some boilerplate code. Essentially, more or less what we're doing here is we're starting up the server. So we're just initializing some stuff. In this case, we're setting up a global prefix so that when we run the application, we can access the routes via /API. And you can also see we're doing some stuff with ports. So we're reading the port from the environment variables. All of this should seem pretty familiar to you if you have done Node.js applications before. You'll also see that we have an app module, which is coming from here. And if I click into that, you can see this app module is using this, and this is called a decorator. If you're coming from Java or any other language that uses decorators, this should look familiar to you, but essentially this is just a way for you to be able to say, hey, I'm defining a module. This module should take in imports, controllers, and a provider. And you can see the controller is, of course, where your endpoints will live. So in this case, /API is going to hit this function here, and this function is going to call the app service. The app service is where all our business logic should be. And in this case, we're just returning hello API in a message, and it's just an object. So this is just boilerplate code that's given to us by NestJS. So this is all looking good. If I wanted to run this application, what I will have to do is, I'm in the Nest workspace at the moment. So I would have to do pnpx nx serve general API. NX is a tool that we're using to generate the workspace. Serve is the command that we want to use. If I do it without anything, it's going to complain and say both project and target have to be specified. So I need to specify general API because that's the name of the API that we want to run. So if I run this, you can see a bunch of things happen. We get some nice logs formatted out of the box. I didn't need to configure that. If I open this, I'm using Arc. So you could see over here, we get hello API. And that's the message that we got from the service that I showed earlier. So this is all looking good. At this point, the API has been configured. We have a way to run it. And I believe we also have a way to test it. Let's find out. So in this case, I can run pnpx nx test general API, and that should run the controller and the service, and it does. This, however, is likely going to break. So if I run this from my UI, it's not going to work because the API isn't running at the moment. But if I were to run the API in the background and trigger this test, it passes. So that's one thing I don't like about the current setup of the tests. I like to run the tests within the context of the general API, the end-to-end test that is. So in the next video, what we're going to do is actually go through the process of moving the test over to this API directory and also making sure that debugging works. So another thing that I like to do with JetBrains IDE specifically is set up debugging so I can be able to actually set up breakpoints and stop my code and check execution and see what's going on rather than adding console logs, because for the backend, that just doesn't work for me. So in the next video, I will be going over tests and debugging. Thank you very much for watching, and please leave any feedback that you might have in the comments down below.